Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, what is right speech?
The Buddha says that the answer depends on the context. It is speech which is endearing, agreeable, and factually true. That all depends on who you're talking to and what's going on at the time.
Indeed, but it seems that it also does not always depend on context. It is speech that is spoken in goodwill, in the right moment, and right according to the Dharma, and with the goal of enlightenment in mind. It is speech which is not divisive, abusive, or false. These seem to be absolutes which are not dependent on a situation or context.
This dual nature of right speech can at times be difficult to reconcile. There is at once an absolute and a relative aspect, and it can be difficult to know which one takes precedence in a given situation.
That is true. I suppose it is the goal of the followers of the Buddha to choose speech which satisfies both conditions in each and every moment.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing social relationships and idle chatter in Buddhism. How does one actually maintain social relationships while also avoiding idle chatter? What actually is idle chatter? How does this apply to lay people and to monks similarly and differently? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get into it. How does one actually maintain social relationships while also avoiding idle chatter?
This is a great question that we saw on Reddit on r/Buddhism a while ago, and we modified it and answered a different version of it in a different episode, but we thought it best to return to the original question exactly as it was worded. This question is pretty compelling because the heart of it is basically, how can you follow the Eightfold Path and still be a member of the world? How can you make friends and carry on relationships with them and with your family and still follow all the rules? So let's start by explaining and defining the terms of the question, and then we can turn to the texts for answers. The issue of idle chatter falls under the purview of right speech, as it is discussed in the Eightfold Path, which, as you know, is one of the two earliest and most fundamental teachings of the Buddha, alongside the Four Noble Truths. The Eightfold Path is the path of morality by which one can find an end to suffering and overcome it. The 8 dimensions of the path are divided into 3 major groups. The first group is the group of insight, or wisdom, which is known as prajna in Sanskrit, and this grouping includes right view and right resolve. The second grouping is moral virtue, known in Sanskrit as shila, and it includes right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The final grouping is meditation, known as samadhi, and it includes right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. It should underscore the importance of the original question to see that right speech is one of the first moral steps on the Eightfold Path. It is the very first human behavior that must be made right in the path to the end of suffering. Not only is it the very first thing that a person ought to work on, it also falls under the purview of moral discipline. That is to say, in a Buddhist conception, speaking and what we choose to say is afforded similar moral import as what we choose to do. Arguably, given that it comes before action, it is afforded more importance than our actual behaviors and actions. But one can also interpret the Eightfold Path as having no beginning and no end, and so it's not entirely productive to pick firsts and lasts among these different dimensions of the path, beyond mentioning what is taught to monks first. Each of these 8 steps on the path has more than meets the eye. In response to the question of what is right speech, or what is right resolve, the Buddha always had an answer. We will discuss all of them at some point, but for the purposes of this question, I want to mention the 4 divisions or the 4 types of right speech in particular. Those 4 types are abstaining from lying, from divisive speech, from abusive speech, and from idle chatter. This division comes up in a few of the Pali Canon suttas, but we are grabbing this one specifically from the Mahachattarisaka Sutta, or the Discourse on the Great 40, where the Eightfold Path is discussed in much greater detail. So, idle chatter is one of the things that ought to be abstained from, alongside lying, abusive speech, and divisive speech. The answer to how one is supposed to maintain social relationships and avoid this is wrapped up in the definition of idle chatter itself.
So let's talk about that. What actually is idle chatter, especially in the Buddhist context?
In our understanding of the definition of the words idle chatter, we can understand it to mean talking when there is nothing of import to be said. It is talking for the sake of talking and hearing one's own voice. The crux of the issue of idle chatter is circumstance and context and the situation between the speaker and the listener. If the speaker is saying something that the listener does not need to hear but is ultimately not harmful or hurtful, then the speech can be called idle. In the Buddhist discourse, the definition is not terribly different, and the translation, therefore, is not too far off. The main difference comes in the Buddhist idea of what speech ought to be directed toward. It becomes a matter of purpose and intention. So we have a few texts where we get a discussion of idle chatter, and I've chosen some of them here to quote and discuss. First, in the Chunda Kamaraputta Sutta, or the discourse directed to Chunda the blacksmith, who you will remember fed the Buddha his final meal in the Parinibbana Sutta, you see this definition of idle chatter under the definition of skillful verbal action. The sutta reads, "Abandoning idle chatter, he abstains from idle chatter. He speaks in season, speaks what is factual, what is in accordance with the goal, the Dhamma, and the Vinaya." In this case, we see that idle chatter is when one speaks out of season, or out of proper context, when one unknowingly speaks falsely due to unawareness, or when someone speaks against or outside the goal of enlightenment, the Dharma, or the rules of the monks and nuns, known as the Vinaya. This is supported by another quote I have pulled out of the Abhaya Sutta. The sutta reads, "In the case of words that the Tathagata knows to be unfactual, untrue, unbeneficial, unendearing, and disagreeable to others, he does not say them." The Buddha later says, "In the case of words that the Tathagata knows to be factual, true, beneficial, and endearing and agreeable to others, he has a sense of the proper time for saying them. Why is that? Because the Tathagata has sympathy for living beings." So the conditions for this are that the speech ought to be factual, it ought to be beneficial toward the goal of the hearer's enlightenment, and it ought to be affectionate, endearing, and compassionate to others. The Buddha says in the Vajrasutta, "Right speech is spoken at the right time. It is spoken in truth. It is spoken affectionately. It is spoken beneficially. It is spoken with a mind of goodwill." That means that in Buddhism, all speech then is turned toward a moral direction and toward the path of enlightenment. Saying something that is not agreeable with the Dharma, something that is not true and factual, something that is not compassionate or endearing to somebody else, all of this is idle chatter at best and divisive or abusive speech at worst, and is therefore a moral transgression that worsens your karma. So let's return to the original question. How does one maintain social relationships and avoid idle chatter? There's a large number of views on this. One person who is a monk commented on the original question on Reddit, stating that you essentially can't avoid it, but that the best you can do is to observe yourself when it happens so you better understand it, as well as to try and use it skillfully and not make it so idle. On the original post, Bhikkhu Jayasara writes, "You cannot avoid idle chatter. Simple as that. Even in my career, where I actively went out of my way to avoid water cooler talk, sometimes it naturally erupts right at your desk when one person comes to visit, and then another, and then another. The key is to bring yourself to a mindful and clearly comprehending state where you are investigating your mind and body as you are experiencing the chatter. This allows you to watch how your mind reacts and impulses to say things. Then you can practice staying silent or developing your ability to say skillful things that steer the conversation on a better path towards its end. When you are just developing a relationship with somebody, sometimes idle chatter helps with that. Even I, as a monk, when meeting a layperson for the first time, may talk about movies, music, and TV growing up, pop culture stuff, etc., stuff like that, in a way to bond and build that connection. This especially happens when I do dishes and other manual labor with laity, a good time to bond. Eventually you drop that and continue to build your relationship on Dharma. It is a convention of the world and human nature. Being blunt and avoiding it does not help you socially. Knowing how to act skillfully is a win-win situation. It is a convention of the world and human nature. Being blunt and avoiding it doesn't help you socially. Knowing how to act skillfully is a win-win situation." End quote. What I see here is that they are saying that while idle chatter is unavoidable, it is a learning opportunity, and skillful use of it is ultimately a good thing. I can agree with that. I would add to it by saying that these moral prescriptions are ideals meant to help you optimize your relationships and your place in the world. These are important prescriptions in the Theravada tradition, and the interpretations I'm giving you primarily come from the Theravada tradition and the Pali Canon. So you remember that we are looking at the approach to enlightenment, which relies on manually redirecting your karma in every single context and situation and aspect of your entire being, from being what it is to being the karma of the Arhat, or the Bodhisattva, or the Buddha. This is a monumental task, and it takes an immeasurable amount of time. That being the case, doing one's best really is the best one can do. Just because it is impossible to do it doesn't mean we should not try our best to plug it into our lives, because no matter what, it will improve our relationships. How many relationships do you have where all you do with the person is talk crap about somebody else or about something you both don't like? How happy are you when you leave conversations with those types of people? If you're building a relationship with a person based entirely on saying bad stuff about the same things, or saying stuff that has no real substance or content to it about the same things, is that really a friendship? In Buddhism, it is not only immoral, but it pushes you off the path of enlightenment and does not teach you anything beneficial about yourself or of the other person, and should be avoided.
How do these concepts apply to lay people and monks, both in similar and different ways?
In the Theravada tradition, for monks, it is much more strict in some cases than it is for the laity. Many of the suttas that I quoted earlier were actually discourses that were directed to an audience of monks specifically. They were the ones getting more detailed discussion of the Eightfold Path and of right speech. That reflects how much more important it is that an arhat or a monastic attain these ideals than it is for a layperson. Lay people don't have an excuse not to be moral beings in Buddhism, and that is not what I'm saying here, but it is true that there is nobody and no reason to enforce the Vinaya rules on them. Lay people primarily make offerings and attend rituals, but they carry on with their regular lives where they have jobs and relationships and no real impetus to teach or to save anybody, let alone themselves. It is fantastic if they do more than that, and doing more than that is encouraged at every turn, but monks have chosen to renounce and chosen to learn the Dharma and understand the Dharma and live the Dharma, and how to figure out and defeat desire and suffering. So they have much more of a responsibility to follow these rules and to lead by example with these rules, or else they will fail at this job that they've chosen for themselves. In their interactions with each other, they have a responsibility to speak compassionately, with goodwill, and with the goal of enlightenment, without attachment and without ignorance or malice. And in their interactions with the laity, they have a responsibility to speak with all of that, as well as the goal of saving them and starting them or carrying them on the path of enlightenment. Lay people are regarded as not being spiritually advanced enough to have the wisdom and the understanding and the commitment and the resolve to commit themselves to the life of an arhat. They are not morally inferior beings and treated worse for being like this. It's just that their time hasn't come yet. In many rebirths, maybe they will gain the wisdom they need to renounce and pursue the path, but that hasn't happened yet. So, all the monks can do is be helpful and compassionate to them along the way.
I'll also add just a observation that I've had myself while trying to understand these concepts. It's worthwhile to know that anything that's worth doing 100% is also worth doing 20% if that's the best you can do. You said it earlier, sometimes the best you can do is just the best you can do. It's still worthwhile and better to put 20% effort in than it is to put 0% because you're tired.
That's exactly right. And, just because the monks and nuns have a higher responsibility to do this, you just might say that they are expected to be able to do 40% instead of 20% of that 100 that we talked about earlier. And that's why it's more strict on them and why they are more involved in this discourse of what exactly constitutes idle chatter and how we can avoid it in every situation. This is where the doctrine and the texts becomes lived, real, actual, day-to-day Buddhism. And so there's some complicated interpretive jumps that people have to go through in order to make this make sense. I've given you some of the ways that these jumps are made in the Theravada tradition specifically. So I should mention that in the Mahayana traditions, all of these points of morality and all of these points of how to live morally in these different situations, such as in your speech and in your mindfulness and in your behaviors, all of these things are questioned at every turn in the Mahayana. So the idea of idle chatter is almost completely done away with, because if someone is engaging in idle chatter, then that must be a skillful means to teach the other sentient beings around you what idle chatter is, so that they know what right speech is, and therefore they know better, so they do better, and they're on the way to the Eightfold Path, right? We've talked about this hidden bodhisattva idea before, and this hasn't gone away with regards to the Eightfold Path. You can always serve as the opposite example in this tradition to the Eightfold Path, so that you teach people what the correct example is and lead them on the path. We've talked about the problems that has going along with it, but ultimately, this morality, it just doesn't hold true anymore. The structure of it, it's perceived in the Mahayana as not really existing, as being more than empty in some cases, but in the very best case, at least, empty of any sort of real true nature. And it's just the words of the Buddha, who was teaching to a particular audience. And, they argue that the audience he was teaching to were the early arhats, and their enlightenment and their study was of a lesser nature. And so when the teaching got more subtle, when it got a little bit more wishy-washy with regards to morality, then those kinds of teachings were superior and much more subtle. And so the idea of what is right speech changed a lot. We talk about this a great deal in our episode, What is the Philosophy of Language and Speech, with regards to Buddhism. And the idea essentially is that all words, any spoken words, written words, anything like that, because they are inherently dualistic, because they inherently have a relationship between all other words and all other meanings, they are a means of attaining an experience of non-duality, even if they themselves are insufficient for describing non-duality or describing enlightenment, right? So idle chatter gets thrown out the window, because if you just hear a word, then if you have the right mindset, if you understand it and study it and examine it and meditate on it in the right way, then technically that single word could be a window through which you can observe non-duality and awakening, and therefore advance on the path. However, as you can see, it takes a lot more interpretive jumps, a lot more, you might say, examination, a lot more deep thought on the part of the meditator, on the part of the person who's trying to do all of these interpretations and analyses of the things that they're experiencing, right? So that's why it's regarded as the more difficult path than the path of the Arhat, than the path of the Theravada school, and that's why it's regarded as being more complicated and also somehow superior, because the work that they're doing is more intellectually difficult. And that's, like we've said, that's problematic, and that constitutes a lot of interdenominational sniping and such. And I'm not so sure that I buy all of that. But I do think that it is an interesting approach to language that's different in the Mahayana compared to the Theravada.
So, what would the advice for the laity be that's different from the two schools? Like, with the Theravada school, we have the old idea of don't have idle chatter. Like, just speak what is true and necessary and helpful and delightful and all of that kind of idea. But what would the practical differences be between these two ideas? Like, does this mean that in the Mahayana tradition, idle chatter is just fine?
So in the Mahayana tradition, idle chatter is not regarded as being as prevalent as you might say it is understood in the Theravada tradition. But additionally, there's also some subtle differences in the advice they give to the laity, and there's also an overall very broad emphasis on faith instead of action. Or not instead of, but maybe faith alongside action. So, starting with the different subtle advice, what we've been saying here is that one of the conditions for idle chatter is that it is not towards the goal of enlightenment. It's not going to help anybody advance spiritually. We've already just talked about here how in the Mahayana, they argue that there is no way that saying something could not lead someone to the path of enlightenment, right? Because of the relationship that words have with each other and the way that they relate to non-duality and such things. The advice that they give is that the laity must speak skillfully. They must use language skillfully. And so while we've been talking about like goodwill and endearing and compassion and stuff, that stuff is all still there, but there is an extra layer of you should say something that the person needs to hear to reach enlightenment right now. And so the urgency and the quickness and the effectiveness of language, the power of language, is a lot more. It's been increased a lot in this Mahayana tradition because the idea is that you can say the exact right string of words to cause the person listening to you to reach enlightenment right now and become a Buddha in this very body. The ideal has changed from being super, super efficient with your speech to being super, super skillful with your speech. That's a very subtle difference, but it's a very big difference.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode about social relationships and idle chatter in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will discuss dharani in Buddhism. What are dharani? What is their doctrinal significance? What are some famous dharani and their usages? We hope to see you there, and thank you very much for listening.
See you next time. Thank you for listening. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or tweet us at brightbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.